In this lesson, we're going to learn how to create our ice dynamic system and then how we can control it here in Softimage. So I'm just going to open up the scene animation final, or the fueling animation final. Of course, if you have your own scene you would like to add ice dynamics to, feel free to open that one. And here is our starting scene. Now we have all of the animation completed, but now we would like some smoke to be billowing out of this pipe. So we need to begin creating some ice particles. Now we can find all of these again in the ice drop-down and particles and the basic emission. However, there's a lot of different ways we can create this basic emission. If we create it with nothing selected, it's going to assume we want to send these particles out of a point in 3D space. Now those are very difficult to visualize in the viewport. So instead, a more common workflow is to create some sort of primitive to emit particles from first. So let's go up to the ice primitive and we can create a polygon mesh or a null. And if we create a mesh, it will be emitted from the points of those mesh. But since our tube here is pretty thin, let's just drop in a new null. Now we'll create that in the center of our scene here. So I'm just going to hit S and F to zoom in on this new null. Now let's also go back to our ice menu now and create the basic emission with this new null selected. So make sure it's selected. Then let's go to ice, create basic emission. And if you're on a non-zero frame, it's going to simulate the emission or simulate the particles, and we have our particles being shot into the scene out of our emitter or out of this null. And again, many different kinds of objects can be used as emitters or as an object to emit these particles out of. Now here inside of our properties panel, or properties view, we have a lot of different options for controlling our particles. So just take a little time to play with this. We're going to jump back to this view here in a second. So let's briefly just take a look at what has happened inside of our Explorer. So I'm just going to close this viewport here, and I'm just going to hit the 8 key to bring up my Explorer panel. Now we can see we have a point cloud, which is where all of our particles live, and we have the null, which we created. Now let's say we need to move our particles over to the right. So we can do this in one of two ways. And one of these ways is the correct way, and the other way is incorrect. Now the incorrect way would to be grab the point cloud and move this. And if we move this around, we can see the particles are moving, and that if we rewind and hit play, the particles will be emitting from that new object. But the reason we created an emitter is so that we could control that. So I just drop back to my user camera here so I don't get the camera shift whenever we hit the play key. And we can see our point cloud is now offset from our null emitter. So again, we usually do not want to move the point cloud. So I'm just going to go to my transforms and I'm going to reset them. Instead, what we want to do is to move our emitter. So let's grab the null, and just for the sake of clarity, I'm just going to hit enter here, and I'm just going to give this a different name. Well, we can call this our null emitter. Of course, we can call this anything. The naming doesn't matter. I just prefer to keep it a little organized. And now let's try and do the same thing by moving the emitter. And we can see that nothing happened. And that's because we have to remember that particles that are inside of our scene remember the past, or are only a picture of the particles from the past. So if we move an emitter, we're not going to be able to see a change until we begin re-simulating. So again, you can hit the play key, or you can middle click to begin simulating from the current frame. And again, I just left click to stop that, or hit the stop key. Now we can see here our particle cloud looks a little bit strange, and that's again, we have not reset the simulation, so we can essentially see here particles from two different states. So just for clarity, I always reset the particles, going back to the first frame and hitting play whenever you change the position, rotation, or any other emitter attribute or property. Because again, these will not be updated inside of our scene until we begin re-simulating. So now let's connect our emitter to this object here. So to begin with, let's have our null emitter selected, and let's just jump over to the transform menu, and let's go down to match all transforms. And this is going to allow us to move, rotate, and scale exactly the same as something else. So let's now zoom in, and let's left click on this effector at the end of our object, or end of our hose. And of course we would left click and match the transforms of whatever we want to connect this to. Now, before we go any further, let's actually go and select that effector. So let's hit the F key here, and I'm just going to hit the space bar to clear my mouse, and I'm just going to select both of these objects here. So I'm going to select the null emitter and our effector. And over here in the Explorer panel, we can hit the F key to frame up both our effector, which is hidden, but we can see it here, and our null emitter. And again, just to make this a little clearer, let's change our null emitter to something else like a square or let's say a pyramid, just to make it a little bit clearer. So again, we have both our effector here and our emitter. So now let's parent our emitter to the effector. To do that, it's pretty simple. So now in our Explorer view, let's come over here and let's just left click and drag the null emitter onto our effector. And so now our null emitter will move wherever our effector moves. So to see this, I'm going to zoom out a little by mouse scroll wheeling backwards, hit rewind again, and hit play. And we can now see our particles are being emitted from our hose. However, at the end of this sequence here, if we take a look closely, we can see the particles are being emitted from the side of our hose instead of the front. And this is a common problem. Usually the orientation will not match up at the first glance. So this is a pretty easy fix, but it leads us into another problem. So you'll recall the property window where we had control over these particles. So let's now try to get back to that. So I'm going to select the point cloud here and hit enter. But we can really see no options here, okay? So let's now try selecting our effector and hitting enter and taking a look at those properties. But again, we do not see what we saw before. And that's because within ICE, to access these properties of our ICE dynamics, we need to go into the ICE tree view. So let's now set up our viewport to have this window here as well as an ICE tree window. So I'm just going to left click this. Actually, let's... Okay, so, excuse me, again, we'll left click this, and this time I'd rather have an ICE view be a vertical view. So let's right click on our window here, and let's just choose vertical. And we can do that for our panel over here, and then we can middle click this actually to extend it sideways, and then let's middle click this bottom view here so we have a vertical split. So again, that was simply right-clicking, going to restore, and then adding in a vertical split of our windows. So now in this bottom panel, let's come down and let's drop this down to the ICE tree. Now if you prefer to work in a pop-out, you can of course hit Alt-9, and that will create a new ICE tree window. However, I like keeping it around in my viewer, so I'm just going to keep it down here. Now again, in our ICE tree, we're not really going to see anything initially. And that's because the ICE tree view starts out locked. And that's because while we're working, we do not want this to change based on our selection. So to access those particle properties we need, let's select our point cloud, which is where our ICE tree lives, and hit this refresh icon. And now this is going to update, and we can see our point cloud object, which we saw in our Explorer, and under the simulation, we have our ICE tree. Now we're getting into a lot of information, so let's just stop here and just review what we've covered so far so we can begin getting into this ICE tree view more in the next lesson. So in this lesson, we covered quite a lot. We talked about creating emitting objects using the get primitive, and in this case we used a null, but you can also use a mesh if you want to. And then with that selected, we went to create basic emission, and then we take a look at the point cloud that was created, which our particles live in, and then we moved our emitter around and parented it and matched the transforms to what we wanted the emitter to follow. And we finally opened up our ICE tree for the first time so we can take a look and begin editing our dynamic system. So in the next lesson, let's come in and start getting into the ICE tree.